I'm still broke. That's what a filmmaker told me at a birthday party recently, after his film had premiered at a top tier festival and his second film had been produced with an 8-figure budget by award-winning producers. Now, why is that? It's because he didn't own the IP. He had no back end, no long tail revenue. He was only paid a flat fee, and then that was it. So this isn't a one-off story, right? It's a common trap that filmmakers can fall into. So today, I'm going to show you why owning your IP is the only real path to long-term wealth and freedom as a filmmaker. So here's what we're going to learn today. Number one, what owning your IP actually means. Number two, real-life examples of filmmakers who have nailed this. And thirdly, a step-by-step path to start owning your IP today. So let's dive in. So too many filmmakers do spend their careers just like chasing jobs, right? It's like a gig economy. Next job, next job, next job. The problem with this is they never build assets. So assets are things that can basically earn you money while you sleep. If you own a property and it's being rented out, that is basically earning you money consistently. If you have a hit film and you own that IP, you're consistently collecting royalties from that film, right? It generates income. The problem is that most filmmakers think they're in the film industry, but they're basically just part of someone else's project. They're part of someone else's building of long-term assets. So here's the truth, right? You don't get wealthy by making films. You get wealthy by owning them. So let's break that down. There's a great economist who I reference quite a bit in my videos, and his name is Art Devaney, right? He wrote a book called Hollywood Economics, and he basically found that a small handful of films make outsized returns, often long after their release. The catch, though, is that the only people with equity actually benefit from that long tail. So when you own IP, you own a piece of that pie. So that means you get back-end profit participation, you have control over how it's distributed, you have revenue from remakes, sequels, licensing, international deals, and you have money that comes in years later, years after your work's been completed, and years after you've moved on from the project. That's what economists like Art Devaney call the long tail. Now, I've certainly been in the trap of making films that don't have long tail, right? And I can tell you that it makes it very difficult to build out a sustainable business when you have no long tail, because all you're doing is you're going from project to project, film to film, and just collecting your fees along the way, right? And then your success is basically hinges on your ability to be able to finance and get that next film into production. So can it happen? Of course it can happen, but it's extremely difficult without that long tail that creates this basically like this gold mine of revenue. And interestingly, when a production company is sold, one of the key things that an acquirer will look at is their library and how much money is being generated from that library. So let's take you through some examples of case studies of IP ownership wins. So we all know the famous one, right? George Lucas gave up his director's fee on Star Wars in exchange for sequel and merchandising rights. What was the result? Single decision made him a billionaire, right? That shows you just like how extreme, or the extreme nature of the results that can be achieved through these single decisions of ownership. Number two, Tyler Perry, right? So he built an empire by owning everything that he made, from his scripts to his studios. So he licensed, distributed, and scaled his content his way. He now owns a massive studio in Atlanta. The key thing with Perry is that he did it his way, right? Because he owned his audience, because he then owned all the projects, because he owned his empire, no one could tell him what to do or how to do it. A more like indie example, which I really like, is Jim Cummings. So he wrote, directed, self-distributed Thunder Road. He retained ownership and revenue rights of that film, and he's used it to build momentum for future films. So, owning your work isn't something that's just for like Hollywood executives or only for producers, right? It's for any filmmaker who's willing to think like a producer and act like a producer. That's the key point. It's about not just being a director or a filmmaker, but really starting to think as an entrepreneur and as a producer. A great example recently of a company that achieved like enormous success when it was sold is a company called Seesaw, which is an Australian company. Its producers produced films like The King's Speech, which made over 300 million, and Lion, along with an array of like amazing award-winning films. So their company was sold recently. The figure wasn't exactly disclosed, but early, like when they were trying to sell it, they were talking around like 150 million. Right now, one of the things that an acquirer is going to look at in a sale like that is the library. So just from King's Speech, they would still be generating, or just from their library, let's say, they would be bringing in millions of dollars of revenue, right? Every single year, just from the films that they've made. That makes that company extremely valuable to an acquirer because they have this consistent cash flow that's being brought in regardless of what happens with their future projects. Now, there's no doubt that their future pipeline, including their TV, they're producing like Slow Horses, a bunch of other stuff, that absolutely had to do with the immense value of the company as well as the talent that's within that company. But that library gives that acquirer like this certainty that there's cash flow coming in. Let's flip it now. So who's an example of a filmmaker who unfortunately didn't own the IP of the film that he made and has lost billions of dollars as a result? So Sylvester Stallone created Rocky. He wrote it, he starred in it, it won Best Picture at the Oscars, and it spawned a billion-dollar franchise. But here's what most people don't know. Stallone doesn't actually own the rights to Rocky. Why? Because in 1976, in order to get that film made, he sold the IP to the producers. He got paid to write, act, and he even had some back-end participation, but the underlying rights, ownership of that IP, gone. So the result is that Rocky became a billion-dollar franchise, including the Creed spin-offs, and he, Stallone, has no control over the IP. And in interviews, he calls this one of his biggest regrets. And I think for him, it's obviously the money's one aspect of it, right? But he's made a lot of money as well along the way. He's been extremely successful. And you could argue that if Rocky didn't get made, let's say he didn't take that deal, his career may never have launched in the way it did. There's an argument to say that. But I think for him, as a creative, losing ownership of that character, of that IP, is probably what he's talking about even more when he says it's one of his biggest regrets. Because he now has no control over the direction that franchise goes in. So if you don't negotiate for ownership, you could miss out on generational wealth. Now, like I said, luckily Sly hasn't done too bad in his life. We love you, Sly. But that you can see how that one decision can have a ripple effect basically for the rest of your life. So let's go through the 3 steps to start owning your IP. Number 1 is you've got to think like an owner from day one. So from the moment you have an idea, ask, how do I retain rights to this? Even if you do eventually bring on producers or investors, structure your deals so you keep a piece of the pie. Even 5 to 10% of the back end and that IP and all those rights, remake rights, sequel rights, that can still be life-changing money, right? So if you write a treatment, that is IP. Okay, you want to own that. If you secure talent, that's leverage that you now have when you go and try and attach a producer to make sure that when you enter into a deal with that producer, you're going to be able to get the best terms possible and keep as much of the IP as possible. So you want to attach yourself early and often to these projects and then you want to lock in your credit, but most importantly, lock in your equity. Now, I'm going to do another video in the future that talks about how to structure deals with producers, but by and large, most producers will option your project, will option your script, and leave you with maybe some back-end participation, but they'll usually try and own all the IP. Now, the way that I run all my projects is very different to that. So the way I do it is from day one, the writer-director gets 50-50 ownership of the IP with me, right? Now, that is very rare. Most producers don't do that. So you need to be aware that going into it, that you're not going to get a deal like that. Most producers are going to own as much of that IP as possible, if not all of it. But the more leverage that you have, even just the more knowledge now by knowing this and going into those deals, you should be able to negotiate a much better position. So you started thinking like a producer. Number two, make yourself a producer. Act like a producer, even if you're a director. So if you're driving the creative vision, you should be attached as a producer. This is my view, right? No doubt there are directors out there who just want to focus on the creative. That's fine. You need to understand, though, what you're potentially missing out on, which is exactly what we're talking about in this video. So look at some, there's actors who have production companies. There are directors who have production companies. Why are they doing that? It's because they're not just acting, they're not just directing, they're producing, because producing means control and it means equity. So next time you're developing a project, include yourself in the producing team from the very start. Now, step 3, what do? You play the long game. So you plan for those tail events. So don't just think about the upfront money that you're going to get from the film. Think about licensing, streaming residuals, international rights, educational sales, remakes or spin-off potential. Most of this revenue comes after the film is released. So what you want to do is you want to negotiate for points, back-end points, and for all of those rights, or a share of the IP, ideally, in your contract. That's how you can build compounding returns, okay? So take those 3 steps, implement them, and then what you're going to be doing is you're going to be building assets that you can own and that can hopefully turn into generational wealth for you. So here's the bottom line. You can keep chasing gigs or you can start building real ownership today. One path is going to make you busy. The other path is going to build wealth. So if you're serious about turning your filmmaking career into something that's sustainable, start owning your work. Because if you don't and you have a hit, you may get your fee and that's it. And then you've missed out on all this revenue that could make this business sustainable for you. Because without that long tail, it is very difficult to make this a sustainable business or a career. So that's it for now. If you're working on your first feature and you do want real world guidance, I send out a free newsletter every Friday with tools, with strategies and breakdowns. And the link to that is in the description below. So head over there, sign up, and you'll get that weekly newsletter. It's called the Friday Filmmaker, and that'll come out every Friday. So that's it here. I'll see you next week.